Could you walk us through the context of your first feature film, What We Left Unfinished?
What We Left Unfinished came out of a larger research project that I was engaged on for about 5 years before I started working on the feature version of it. And the research project came out of this engagement with the Afghan Films Archive, the National Film Archive of Afghanistan, which began even before that research project. And really the impulse for that was coming from the archive itself and their desire to launch a full-scale digitization project in their archive. And so I kind of came on board during the Documenta 13 workshops in Afghanistan, and was asked to kind of go to the archive and see if they would be interested in doing a workshop as part of the Documenta 13 workshops. And I asked them, what they might be interested in getting out of such a workshop. And they said, well, we want to do a digitization project. And I said, well, we only have 10,000 euros. So we probably can't digitize the whole archive with 10,000 euros, but do a proof of concept project for you. And that's what we ended up doing during the workshop together with friends from Padma in Mumbai, the Public Access Digital Media Archiving Project. That was the beginning of my long and complicated relationship with the Afghan Films Archive. And during that kind of initial workshop, I first started hearing about these unfinished films that were in the archive. And the existence of unfinished films in Afghan cinema history in general, and that was very intriguing to me. The idea of these films that had been left unfinished during, I would say, turbulent political periods in Afghan history. And that was a connection also that interested me. These kind of unfinished political projects that might be mirrored in unfinished artistic projects. And I saw part of the April Revolution also during that first workshop, because we were digitizing clips from Farar, Escape, that had recycled part of the April Revolution into Farar. And so that's when I first found out about the April Revolution, which is, of course, this extraordinary film that reenacts the communist coup of 1978, and was shot only 3 months after the actual coup. With Hafizullah Amin reenacting what he did on the day of the coup, and the entire army and air force, reenacting the coup. And it's really, this kind of amazing document. Over the next few years, as the archive started recataloging and preparing to digitize the archive and fundraising and so on, I, in parallel started looking for these unfinished films. And it did take quite a long time to actually find them, and also to track down people who had worked on them. And that's really how the project began.
You've recuperated part of the Afghan film narrative, which is the communist era, that's typically left out of its retellings in mainstream media and literature. So I was wondering how you navigated this epistemic gap through the film.
I think there's a very complicated set of questions around addressing the communist era in Afghanistan that come up when you try to tell it as a history, and that have to do with the way in which there is no fixed history of that period yet, and perhaps never will be. In Afghanistan, the way we experience that time is as a civil war. So, when you're trying to tell the history of a civil war, you can't really tell it as a single history, because there's always multiple histories of something like a civil war. There's very contested and conflicting ways of telling that time, none of which really resolve into a single fixed history that everyone agrees upon, as the history of that time. And so in making this film, I wanted to be attentive to that, and to really not attempt to close those gaps or resolve those contradictions, but rather to really, leave them in the film, and to, in a way, emphasize them, and to emphasize their existence, and to really talk about the way in which that period is very unsettled still historically for us as Afghans. that's where I really wanted to play with the notion of epistemic gaps more than like thinking about the entire period as an epistemic gap in a larger history from the external perspective. Because, you know, in making this film, I wasn't thinking so much about the West or for, you know, people who are looking at Afghan history from the outside. I was really thinking about making it more for Afghan history in a way, and thinking about what don't we know about our own history, you know, or what stories haven't we told to each other.
Amassed archival material from different filmmakers from different eras, and so I was wondering if you could walk us through the process of its making and any interventions you might have made in the arrangement, or any interesting anecdotes that you might have come across that you then played around with.
Yeah, first of all, it's important to say that, you know, what you kind of perceive when you're watching the film as sort of clips from almost finished films are in almost every case not that. So the only film that had any kind of editing done to it when we received the footage was Agent, Gomashta. And all of the other films we received as completely raw footage with no sound. So everything that looks like a clip from a film is something that we constructed in the editing. Also, all of the sound attached to those clips is sound that we made in a DIY Foley pit in Rensselaer, New York. When you ask about, you know, things that interventions that we made, almost all of it is intervention that we made, you know, in the footage, but it's done in a manner so as to seem as if we didn't do it, right? So we were really trying to work in the spirit of the period and to cut things in the way that other films by those filmmakers were cut, or to cut them in the way that editing was done at the time, and to use sound in the way that sound was used at the time, sound design and Foley. And I think it's not exactly like that. It's sort of in between a kind of more modern style and that kind of period style. And so it falls somewhere in the middle. It has this, you know, interesting way of kind of passing when people watch it, or where a lot of people do watch the film and they think those clips are just like clips that existed. Whereas they're almost all things that we made. So yeah, there's a lot of intervention going on. And that was most of the work of the editing, was us making these fictional scenes, which then get folded into the nonfiction of the film.
Did you have an overarching narrative in mind while making this feature film?
I mean, it is a non-narrative film, so, you know, in that sense, I don't think we were trying to make a narrative. And, you know, the way you construct a non-narrative film is not the same way that you construct a narrative film. There are arcs and threads of the film, but the way you write a film like this is not by writing a story. We actually construct in sections rather than, you know, necessarily constructing like the full film as one story arc that has a beginning, middle, and end that are obvious from the beginning. It's one of the interesting things about documentary editing is that you're really discovering the film as you're making it, rather than starting out with a very firm idea of what the film is. And I think that's one of the exciting things about making non-narrative film, is that the film kind of reveals itself to you in the making, rather than you starting out with this kind of script that you're definitely going to stick to through the whole process, right? One of the things that the film does try to do is pose a number of questions that it doesn't necessarily answer. And I think that's, you know, one of the things that it very deliberately does.